Hello folks, welcome to State and Revolution, the final chapters, chapters 6 and 7. Why I'm combining the two chapters, you know if you read the book, but if you didn't read the book, it's pretty humorous, chapter 7 is. But anyways, chapter 6 is called The Vulgarization of Marx by the Opportunists. So, Lenin, as he usually does, is going to be critiquing Kautsky and the Second International, which at the time was this huge workers' party with international solidarity. They were espousing Marxism, and they had the Social Democratic Party in Germany, where Kautsky was, kind of as their base, their biggest party, their center of operations, and they had international support, international solidarity. They were the biggest Marxist party at the time, in the early 1900s. But the party leadership became corrupted by capitalists and the growth of capitalism. Like we said, during Marx's time, capitalism is growing at an insane rate. And its perversive powers are growing as well, and the Second International starts to become corrupted by the capitalists and start moving to reformism. And this is going to come to a head before what's called the Imperialist War, or World War I. When the Second International voted for the war, in favor of it, and supported it, and used the line saying they were anti-Tsarist, right? They were just against the Russian Tsar, and therefore they needed to protect Germany from the Russian Empire, and ended up supporting this disastrous war, World War I, which was an imperialist war, a war for capitalist expansion, which killed 10 million people. And this is what Lenin called the collapse of the Second International. And Lenin says when he read in the paper that the Second International had voted for the war, he thought it was fake. He didn't even believe it. And Leon Trotsky said it was one of the most tragic experiences of his life, to watch the largest workers' party in the world bow to imperialism and bow to opportunism and bow to the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. The Second International, at this point when Lenin is writing, are using Marx to justify the war against the Tsar, or against Tsarism, as they said, which was really just an imperialist war, World War I, that all the capitalists wanted people to support. So the Second International is like, oh, there's so much popularity for the war, we better support it. Similar stuff happens in America all the time. There's tons of socialist parties who ended up like supporting Iraq and Syria and stuff. And you got my boy Bernie supported the bombing of Yugoslavia. So it's really easy for people to bow to opportunism if you're not staunchly anti-imperialist. And that's what Lenin's going to talk about here. And he's going to critique Kautsky and Plekhanov, who are the leading theoreticians of the Second International at the time. So the first part is called Plekhanov's Polemic Against the Anarchists from 1894. He's going to, before he rips into Kautsky for like 10 more pages, he's gonna talk about Plekhanov, this other member of the Second International. So Plekhanov wrote a two-part pamphlet. Part 1 is the history of anarchist thought, talking about Stirner and Proudhon, and Lenin says that's pretty good, interesting, worth reading. In part 2, Lenin calls a clumsy argument which compares anarchists to bandits. Lenin says the argument ignores the most important question which distinguishes anarchists from Marxists, and that is the relation of the revolution to the state. Lenin draws from Engels and Marx feud against Bakunin and the anarchists, and he says the anarchists attempted to claim the Paris Commune as their own success. Engels and Marx said no, and the anarchists are failing to scientifically analyze the Commune and drawing the correct lessons, aka the state needs to be shattered and replaced with a worker state to defend the revolution, destroy the bourgeoisie, and transition into communism. The anarchists are not drawing that conclusion. They're not analyzing the Paris Commune the way that Marx and Lenin are. The anarchists are just anti-state, right? We don't want a state. Marx and Lenin support this transitionary phase into a higher stage of communism. So Plekhanov doesn't even mention the state in his critique of anarchism and therefore misses the whole point. And Lenin says it's just pure opportunism and distraction to do a polemic and a critique of the anarchists without even bringing up the state, which is the main point of distinction between Marxists and anarchists. And that's the end of part 1, just a real short little debunk of Plekhanov. It used to be called polemic, right? If you were writing something about another author and you're like, your ideas are whack, you call it a polemic. Now it's called a debunk because of the internet, and I just use that to describe Lenin. Shaking my head. I like polemic more. But anyway, so part 2 is called Kautsky's polemic against the Opportunists. So Kautsky is very popular in Russia for his polemics against Bernstein. Bernstein was this reformist who said we need to work through the state and slowly transition to socialism. The state is not an apparatus for the suppression of the proletariat and the enrichment of the bourgeoisie. The state is something that can be controlled through voting and other means, and we can slowly transition to socialism. And as we said, Kautsky critiques Bernstein, so Lenin's going to ask, how did he go from critiquing Bernstein, a reformist, and upholding Marx, to eventually supporting World War I and going full reformist opportunist himself? So Lenin says that Kautsky, from the beginning, even though he was critiquing Bernstein, was always too soft on the opportunists. He was hesitant at first to even critique Bernstein. He didn't want to. Lenin's going to say, you can see this opportunism within within Kautsky, if you look at even the works of his that we like. So Bernstein said that Marx didn't support revolution because he said that workers can't use the ready-made state machinery. Lenin earlier debunked this idea by Bernstein and said that Marx advocated for shattering the state machinery, right? So Bernstein was trying to say Marx wouldn't support shattering the state machinery. He wanted slow transition. Lenin says that's bullcrap. Marx wanted to shatter their state machinery and replace it with something else to protect the revolution. What did Kautsky say to Bernstein? Kautsky says that workers can use the state machinery and ignores the part about shattering it, just glossing over it and glossing over the question of the state, similar to how Plekhanov did. So really he's critiquing Bernstein, but he's not saying concretely, no, Marx advocated for shattering of the state apparatus. Opportunists often ignore Marx's words on the state. This is the main thing that Lenin says leads people to opportunism, is ignoring what Marx said about shattering the state and how freedom can't exist until no state exists at all. Kautsky adds Kautsky's second piece that Lenin is going to analyze here is called the Social Revolution, and this also evaded speaking about breaking up the state machinery. Kautsky talks about replacing the bourgeois democracy with a proletarian democracy, right? But he doesn't talk about shattering the state machinery and replacing it with something new. He's talking about transition, right? Let's keep the state the same. Let's just replace the current machinery with workers instead of bureaucrats. This is opportunism. The state needs to be seized, broken up, and rebuilt as workers' bodies rather than a bureaucracy. So Kautsky espouses essentially a workers-run parliament where unions and co-ops elect bureaucrats, and Lenin says this is dumb. The workers need to shatter the parliamentary bureaucracy, as we discussed earlier, and replace it with working bodies rather than the already existing bureaucracy. Lenin says to replace bureaucracy, you need a system where the people who are in these bureaucratic positions, like accountants and managers, are subject to instant recall. So if the workers want to get rid of these people at any time, they can. They're paid the same as workers, so you no longer have a class of people who don't work or who don't do manual labor who exist above workers as far as in terms of wealth, and immediately began transitioning to a state where there's no bureaucracy, right? So as we keep talking about accounting and planning, and these things are extremely necessary in the transitionary phase from socialism to communism, or the low stage of communism to a high stage of communism. But the goal always needs to be eliminating this bureaucracy, right? Which is where we talked about in the last chapter, is sort of where the Soviet Union started to fail post-Lenin. It needs to be changed from from parliamentary bodies to working bodies, as we went into detail about in the chapter about parliamentarism. So Kautsky's third work that Lenin's going to look at is The Road to Power, which is, I think it's Kautsky's most famous book. It's the one that the only one I've ever been told to read, right? Nobody really says, you got to read Kautsky, but some people will recommend that you read The Road to Power. So Kautsky looks at the increasing class antagonisms which are driven by imperialism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. As we talked about in our breakdown of the book Imperialism, capitalism is reaching a new and higher stage, and capitalists are sending working people to war to expand their territory all around the world. And Kautsky looks at this and says the class antagonisms are increasing. You now have the capitalists sending the workers to fight and die in wars for capitalist expansion. which means the revolutionary era is beginning, Kautsky says. And he says this is even more important now that we have a proletarian revolution, because the class antagonisms are increasing and capitalism is going into this new stage of violent imperialism. So Lenin says that this shows that how far Kautsky actually fell when he came to support the war, right? He went from saying imperialism is this evil that increases class antagonisms. You have the bourgeoisie sending the proletariat to fight and die in wars for capitalist expansion. And Kautsky realized this, but then he went on to support World War I, a war for capitalist expansion where 10 million workers died. And Road to Power, as the other books did, also ignores this question of the state. And Lenin's going to say having no concrete view of the state is what leads Kautsky, who knows, to opportunism and the support for capitalist imperialism, right? He views the state, he glosses over the state, right? He has no concrete views of the state. Marxists or Marxist-Leninists view the state as a tool for the oppression of the proletariat, which means in order to stop imperialism, you have to shatter the state, and then you have to use it to get rid of the bourgeoisie, the industrial capitalists and the financial capitalists, the banking capitalists who do imperialism overseas, you know, the oil oligarchs who lobby for the Iraq War, the military-industrial complex, the pharmaceutical companies extracting tons of opium out of Afghanistan. I'm using contemporary examples here. But as Marxists, you know, living in the U.S., we view our government as really obviously only used for the suppression of the working class and for bolstering the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and for expanding their capital overseas via imperialism. Therefore, we can take a principled stance against imperialism because we realize our state acts in the interest of the bourgeoisie. Kautsky does not have this concrete view of the state, and therefore he was susceptible to supporting imperialism, and he did support World War I. So now we'll move on to the longest part of chapter 6 here, Kautsky's polemic against Pannekoek. I don't know, we're going to call him Pannekoek. I don't know how to pronounce it. This is part 3. So Pannekoek was this guy who was in the left radical movement with Rosa Luxemburg. And he believed that Kautsky was taking a center position between Marxism and opportunism, which was proven by Kautsky's vote for the war. So Pannekoek says that the proletariat, I'll just call them the proles. The proles, lost my place. The proles' struggle is not to acquire state power, but to struggle against the state and eventually destroy it. And Kautsky responds to this by saying Marxists want to conquer state power, whereas anarchists want to abolish the state. And Pannekoek, he says, is taking a middle position in between these two, which is wrong. And Lenin says, no, the real difference between Marx and anarchists is that Marx see a need for a transitionary phase between capitalism and communism where the state is shattered and replaced with something that can destroy the bourgeoisie and protect the proletarian revolution. Marxists have concrete ideas on what to replace the state with and how to use it to defend from the bourgeois counter-revolution. How do we take the state and use it to protect the proles, make it an apparatus that serves the proles, and protect them from the inevitable counter-revolution that will come from those who were previously in the ruling class. Marxists insist on using the modern state to prepare workers for revolution, whereas anarchists say, nah, screw the state, we don't need it at all. So with Kautsky not advocating for the breakup and use of state power to defend against the revolution is therefore distorting Marxism, right? He's saying Marxists wanted us to kind of vote people in, you know, take the state as it currently exists into us. It'd be like in the U.S. kind of people who advocate like, we'll just vote for enough people like AOC, and then eventually we'll transition into socialism. And Lenin is saying, no, this is a distortion. Marx said, seize state power, break it up as it currently exists, get rid of Congress, get rid of all these apparatuses, and replace them with ones that serve the workers, hopefully decentralized, you know, sort of communal organizations, sort of like the Soviet working bodies created in the early days of the Soviet Union. So Lenin quotes Marx on centralism. Kautsky quotes Marx on centralism. He says that Marx supported centralism and therefore he would support keeping the current state apparatus intact. And Lenin says this is a sleight of hand, acting as if Marx advocating for centralism didn't mean he wanted the current centralized state to be destroyed and replaced with a proletarian centralized state. right? Marx advocates for centralism, but he says the current capitalist state is centralized, but that needs to be overthrown and be replaced at first with a centralized power that serves the workers. And Kautsky ignores this, which Lenin calls a sleight of hand, and he says, look, Marx wants centralism. That means he wants us to keep the state, right? Wrong, Kautsky. You're wrong. So Kautsky says we can't abolish the state functions like the Ministry of Education because we just want them to be controlled by the workers, right? There are all these different ministries that are currently controlled under capitalism by corrupt bureaucrats, and we just want these to be controlled by the workers. That's what Marxists advocate for. And Lenin says the specific ministries and government functions are unimportant. All that matters is that these functions serve the workers and are handled, and the hundreds of ties between these state apparatuses and the bourgeoisie are destroyed and done away with, right? It doesn't matter necessarily what kind of Ministry of Education each socialist country sets up, so long as it's adherent to the workers, rather than our current the U.S. is always such great examples of like how the state is controlled by capitalists. We have Betsy DeVos as our Secretary of Education, someone who has multiple yachts, I think 10 yachts. There was a news story when someone cut one of her yachts off the dock and it like floated away. So obviously deep ties to the capitalists. Her cousin or brother is Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, this private mercenary group who does things overseas for the U.S. military. Clearly in the U.S., our state is completely controlled by the capitalists, and the kind of Ministry of Education we set up, it's inconsequential until we actually go to do it, but it can't be Betsy DeVos, right? It needs to be adherent to the workers, rather than setting up college as a way to scam kids out of money or as a way to ship kids into the military because they need to get their college paid for. College is provided for everybody who wants it, and it serves the masses of society. So Kautsky says that we need officials and unions and parties right now, so we're going to need to keep them later. Lenin says we need these officials right now under capitalism, and capitalism is what corrupts these officials and turns them into bureaucrats. And I think of the example of Venezuela here. Obviously, Venezuela has a socialist movement, but there's corruption within the trade unions and within the government. Most of that corruption is capitalist corruption, right? It's foreign capital saying, hey, don't be loyal to socialism, Venezuelan politicians. I'll give you $100 to let foreign capital into your country, or, whatever. It's these bureaucracies, or these people in charge of these workers' organizations become corrupted, not because socialism is inherently corrupting, but they become corrupted by the capitalists and by money. And by overthrowing capitalism, we can eventually eliminate this bureaucracy, which is loyal to the bourgeoisie, and replace it with working bodies who are loyal to the proletariat. And the Soviet Union did this at first until they were eventually sort of infiltrated by foreign and private capital. They had these working bodies. People had much more control over their workplace. It was much more democratic. Obviously, they had to deal with World War II, and they had to do forced industrialization. So there was, authoritarianism, I guess you could call it, going on. But at first, they had a lot of decentralized bodies that gave gave workers more power over what they were doing until they became infiltrated by private capital. And if Lenin is saying if we eliminate this private capital, we can eventually eliminate bureaucracy completely. And we will no longer need these things, although we'll probably need them at first. So Kautsky argues that the trade union abandoned full democracy for bureaucracy under complete freedom, and therefore bureaucracy is better than democracy. So he's saying that because the trade unions need bureaucrats and they need negotiators in between the workers and the capitalists, this proves that bureaucracy is better than just democracy of the workers' unions. Lenin says, how did the unions develop in complete freedom? The unions are constantly under attack from the capitalists and have to adopt methods of the capitalists, such as bureaucracy, in order to survive. Because the capitalists are, one, always trying to crush them, and two, always trying to corrupt them. Say, here, quit fighting against us, person in charge of the union. Here's $1 million. We see a lot of that today. A lot of people who are dissatisfied with their unions and feel like the unions don't help them. And Lenin is saying this is a product of capitalism, right? This is capitalists bribing the union bureaucracy. This doesn't mean that bureaucracy is inherently better than democracy of the workers. And socialism won't need any type of management for the unions, as there's no longer a capitalist to crush and corrupt the unions. Opportunists ignore the shattering of the state. So we're moving on to a little bit of a different part here. Lenin says, opportunists ignore the shattering of the state, and anarchists ignore the question of what is to be built after the state is shattered. Right? So opportunists say, no, don't shatter the state. We'll just kind of transition to socialism through the current means of the state, voting and whatnot. And anarchists ignore the question of what is to be built after the state is shattered. They just say, shatter the state sucks. And Marx is different from this in that he says, destroy the state and then build a society free of the state and free of state bureaucracy through a transitionary phase. With a state that is loyal to the proletariat, a state, worker state, I guess you could call it. Although Lenin would probably reject the name worker state. But anyways, Kautsky says workers must only strike to change the state functions, but not to overthrow the state itself. So he's saying only go on strike for higher wages, or only go on strike for the state to provide you health care. Don't go on strike and demand that you control the state altogether. Don't have an actual revolution. And Lenin says that Kautsky wants the state to meet workers halfway, rather than to establish dictatorship of the proletariat, rather than to shatter the state and create something new, something that is not inherent to the bourgeoisie. And Kautsky, Lenin says, wants to work within the framework of bourgeois republics. It's kind of like that Mark Fisher book, Capitalist Realism. Lenin's basically saying Kautsky can't see outside of the framework that's been set up by democracy under capitalism. He's saying we need to work within this framework, work within the capitalist state to get where we want to go. And Lenin is saying, no, you're crazy. We need to shatter the state, replace it with something new. And this, Lenin says, leaves tons of loopholes to opportunism when you don't shatter the state. And obviously, I'm a huge advocate, I'm going to talk about this for a sec, of countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, Venezuela, who have been looking for this democratic transition to socialism from capitalism. And essentially, they do it through strong trade unions. And the trade unions are essentially, they're striking for dictatorship of the proletariat, right? They're not doing what Kautsky says here. They're not saying, give us a minimum wage, government, or we'll go on strike. They're saying the government needs to be controlled by the workers, controlled by the unions, otherwise we'll go on strike. So they are trying to establish dictatorship of the proletariat. But there are also all these loopholes open for opportunism, and I think that's why you see a lot of corruption in these countries. One, the West is constantly infiltrating these countries and trying to corrupt them. But two, they allow these far-right parties backed by the West to go around and do whatever they want, rather than using the state to crush them, right? People say Venezuela and Bolivia are authoritarian. They're really not. They allow too much private capital and too many of these far-right U.S.-backed capitalist parties, like Janine Áñez's party in Bolivia, but thank goodness she was just arrested, which is what I want to see more of. And then Guaido in Venezuela. You know, the government has protected Guaido from the people who want to kill him because they know the U.S. is backing Guaido, and if they got rid of him, the U.S. might even fully invade their country, and they want to avoid that. And I think what Lenin would advocate here for with dictatorship of the proletariat is just arrest those people, throw them in jail. We don't need them. You don't need to allow an opposition party if the opposition party is literally a fascist gang, like is the case in Bolivia. So we need full dictatorship of the proletariat, not a democratic transition. And the socialist experiments, the peaceful sort of transitions to democracy in Latin America, you might think these are Kautskyite, revolutions, but they're really not, right? Because they're not striking to beg the capitalist government for something, right? And it wouldn't be like in Germany, where the IG Metall Union, which has 2.2 million members, is constantly going on strike and working for, not going on strike, but threatening strike and working for pay increases and stuff from the government, and then the government is working for the bourgeoisie, and the unions demand stuff from the government. That's kind of what Kautsky's saying we should do here. And I do think that's better than nothing. That's better than what we have in the U.S. But in Latin America, what's going on is the unions are saying, we'll strike unless we can keep, workers in power of the state. Workers need to have full control of the state, even though they have elections where the opposition parties and whatnot are allowed to run. So chapter 7 That's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 is called The Experience of the Russian Revolutions of 1905 and 1917. So Lenin says that full volumes should be written about the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, but he wants to just pull out the most important lessons. And then the book cuts off. And Lenin says that he can't write anymore because of the 1917 October Revolution, which is going on in real life, and it's more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of a revolution than to write about it. So chapter 7 cuts off half a paragraph in, and Lenin says, peace out, guys. We'll talk about the Russian Revolution later. I gotta go do a real revolution right now in 1917. And that's how the book ends. But I think there is something to be learned from chapter 7 there, as Lenin says, full volume should be written about the attempted revolutions in Russia. So up to that point, you really only had the Paris Commune and then the Soviet Union, what would eventually be the Soviet Union, as far as workers' uprisings that we could look at and study, as well as the attempted revolutions in Russia in 1905 and 1915. Today, in 2020, as I've been doing this whole time, looking at the different socialist experiments, there are I don't know about hundreds, but there are tons of countries who have tried to establish socialism and tried to build socialism with varying success. And basically all of them have increased standard of living for their workers, but some of them have been unable to maintain themselves. Obviously, I've been critiquing the Soviet Union a lot and what they later became after Lenin. We've drawn on Nicaragua and how they used religion to build their revolution. We've talked about the Latin American socialist countries and what they've done. We've talked about China and what they are continuing to do. And these are all available to us, and there's this thing in the West where, because of the media propaganda and the fact that we've been brainwashed into thinking that all of these countries and all these socialist experiments were just failures, and that's that. They sucked, they didn't do anything right, let's wash our hands of them and never try them again and move to something else. This idea that's been beat into us by the U.S. media, the U.S. government, and the U.S. education system is what keeps us from thoroughly analyzing the socialist experiments of the past and critiquing them and saying, this is what they did wrong, this is what they did right, this is what we're going to repeat, and this is what we're never going to do again. Which is what's really important to do, I think, and that's what Lenin would probably have us do. All right, everyone, that's the end of State and Revolution. It's been a journey. It's been a blast. Thank you for reading this book with me. Much love. We'll see you next time.